Quran. You just got to make sure that you're being specific when you talk about terrorism of any faith, but more specifically, Islamic terrorism.
They're not waiting to hear your opinion or my opinion. They want to kill us both. And this is why we must discuss how we can defeat the radicals who want to kill us, who are using the Quran as their source and justification for their murder.
Why are we having this discussion if you and I are irrelevant? Why?
When they would stop them. And in Lebanon, our religion is written on our national ID. You are either a Christian, a Muslim, or a Jew. So when they find out that you are a Christian, they would get everybody out of their car and shoot them in cold blood. It became...
This Muslim activist walked in thinking she could outsmart CNN Brigitte Gabriel with the usual script about Islamophobia, moderate Muslims, and tiny fringes. Linda Sarsour believes she had the winning arguments to shut down any serious criticism of Islam. Watch what happens when a stoic Muslim woman starts fighting a lost war on live television.
Brian, Miss Gabriel speaks out of two sides of her mouth. I mean, first of all, she's in one breath she'll say the West must support moderate Muslims and the moderate Muslims must speak up against terrorism. And in the same breath, she'll say peaceful Muslims are
The core issue here is, does criticism of Islamic terrorism equal prejudice against Muslims? Does it?
Miss Gabriel needs to make up her mind when it comes to what is radical Islam. When asked by Australian News, she said a radical Muslim is someone who prays 5 times a day, someone who believes in the word of the Quran, which is the Muslim holy book, someone who believes the Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him, is a perfect man. That's basically every Muslim, so I have no idea what she means and where is the room for moderate...
The Muslim activist Linda Sarsour tried to frame all concern as exaggerated fear-mongering and demanded that only moderate Muslim voices should be heard. This approach was always going to fail because it avoided the central problem, the pattern of violence. When you look at global terrorism data, the overwhelming majority of major attacks, beheadings, and mass killings trace back to groups acting in the name of Islam. Ignoring that pattern while accusing critics of bias does not make the threat disappear. It only delays honest discussion.
Islam.
We need to support moderate Muslims, and we work with them. We actually have keynote speakers at our national conference who are moderate Muslims. I had a TV show where we invited them on to be on our TV show. We want to expose their message, but that's completely different than dealing with terrorism, what I deal with as a terrorism analyst. And that's what we need to discuss. The moderate Muslims, they can organize. Where are their collective voices? Where are the voices of the moderate Muslims speaking when girls were kidnapped by Boko Haram?
If the majority is truly peaceful, why does the same pattern of violence and supremacism keep emerging wherever Islamic populations grow significantly? Let me know what you think in the comments.
There are people out there that stood up on Boko Haram, on terrorism, on 9/11. There are national Muslim organizations who continue day in and day out to put out statements. Is the media covering it? I don't have control over the media to cover these stories, and I don't have to prove to anyone that I am an American born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, and that my parents chose to come to the United States from living under military occupation in Palestine. And you talk about going into a grocery store in Arlington, Virginia, because you speak Arabic and you understand the culture and that's where you get your credibility from. I understand the culture and I speak the language too. And I've never, ever walked into a grocery store or into a hookah lounge or into a community center or a mosque in this country where people were saying that they wanted to destroy.
She pushed hard on the idea that 75 to 85% of Muslims are peaceful and therefore the ideology itself should be off limits. This argument collapses quickly once you examine what peaceful actually means in practice. Many may not strap on bombs themselves, but large numbers still support core ideas such as Sharia supremacy, death for apostasy, or jihad as religious duty. Brigitte rightly distinguished between individual Muslims who live quietly and the teachings that continue to inspire violence worldwide. Claiming the majority's peacefulness excuses the doctrine is a classic evasion tactic that has failed for decades.
What is being put out. There has been a study after study of the material that have been found in different mosques across the country, research after research, and these are factual research that have been presented to our government.
Do you do terrorism? Are you a terrorism analyst on terrorism in general? What about the Las Vegas shooting, the manifestos, the Oak Creek shooting where white supremacists walked into a Gurdwara and killed 6 people?
Terrorists are terrorists. Terrorists are terrorists.
Well,
I immigrated to the United States and I continued having the Middle East as my focus. And that's what I talk about. We are dealing, Linda, with a radical Islamic element that wants to wreak havoc on the United States. There are cars driving in New York right now, testing for biological or chemical agents in the air to make sure that nothing has been detonated 24 hours a day. In New York City, in Chicago, in major cities in the United States, trying to protect the country.
But will we not
That
look
is
back?
something we need to discuss.
Brigitte has consistently worked with ex-Muslims and reform voices. The real problem is the deafening silence or weak condemnation from major Muslim organizations when atrocities happen. Pointing this out is not hatred. It is demanding accountability from the community that claims to be misrepresented.
Absolutely. I mean, let's look at the Boston bombing. The first front page story came out on the New York Post of 2 young Algerian boys with book bags, calling them the bagmen. Immediately when an incident happens in this country that includes someone who just happens to be of an Arab country of origin or Muslim, we immediately start talking about terrorism and domestic terrorism. And when we have the same cases, similar cases, shootings almost every week in this country where dozens of people are being killed at the hands of guns and lax gun control, I'm more worried about getting shot by a gun or by a shooter in the U.S. than I am from a terrorist attack. The media oftentimes, including Fox News in particular, who actually does hit series on people like me for standing up and speaking my mind and practicing my American patriotism, the media does play a role in this, but it also gives, again, the platform to people who are pseudo-experts. And just because you grew up in the Middle East and just because you supposedly lived under a war doesn't make you a terrorism analyst. There are people who have extensive training in this area and at the same time can talk about very fringe Islamic terrorism without talking about Islam as a religion being a threat, the fastest growing religion in the country. And what Ms. Gabriel and her friends don't say is that many of the foiled plots that in this country...
Attempts were made to shift focus to other forms of extremism, gun violence, or media bias. These deflections are common but ineffective. While other threats exist, they do not match the scale, frequency, or ideological motivation of radical Islamic terrorism across dozens of countries. From Boko Haram kidnapping schoolgirls in Nigeria to ISIS beheadings to attacks in Europe and America, the common thread is explicit reliance on Quranic commands and the example of Muhammad. Pretending this is equivalent to isolated cases of other violence ignores the doctrinal engine driving the global pattern. Linda Sarsour's personal story and identity does not change these uncomfortable statistics.
By information that came directly from the community, in some cases even the immediate family members of those who were alleged to be organizing a terrorist attack or traveling to places like Pakistan and others.
We're talking about, as 2 Americans, about how we can protect our country. We are both faced with an enemy wishing both our destruction. When those people attacked the World Trade Center, they wanted to kill Americans, Muslims, Christians, and everybody. When Zazi or Shazad wanted to blow up Times Square or the New York subway system, they were planning on killing Americans, teenagers, people taking the subways back to work or back home. They wanted to kill all of us. When you're talking about plots of mass scale, somebody parking a car about to explode in Times Square, or want to blow up the subway system in New York, or want to blow up the Sears Tower in Chicago, we're talking about the mass killing of thousands of Americans, if not millions. That is what we need to be discussing and how we can protect the country.
The emotional appeal about 9/11 victims, including Muslims, and the need to partner with the community sounds reasonable on the surface. However, it misses the bigger point. The 9/11 attackers were not acting to spite Islam. They were acting because of their understanding of its core texts. Thankfully enough, Brigitte correctly noted that terror leaders are often scholars deeply versed in the Quran and Hadith. They are not ignorant outsiders. The doctrine divides the world into Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. making permanent peace with non-Muslims impossible until Islam dominates. This supremacist framework explains why integration fails in so many Western countries and why moderation often proves temporary.
The idea here is that you want to talk about terrorism, let's talk about terrorism, and let's be prepared. But let's not prepare the American people that all terrorism that happens around the world comes from the Muslim community. That's the point that I want to debate with you here.
Well,
is that the idea here that terrorism is a serious issue, but terrorism does not equal Islam. It does not equal Muslims. I am from New York. I live in New York. I was here in New York on 9/11, Ms. Gabriel. I understand the impact that 9/11 had on communities in New York City. I could have been in the World Trade Center. I could be dead here today. There were Muslim responders. There were Muslims. 75 Muslims died in 9/11, including a first responder, Salman Hamdani. So I want you to understand that if you want to combat terrorism, you need to work within the Muslim community. You need to make sure that we are part of that discussion. And the, quote, moderate Muslims that you're talking about, which are almost every Muslim living here in this country, need to be part of this discussion. But to alienate the Muslim community, create them as the other, and to start making over-exaggerations about these potential attacks that haven't happened is not the way that you combat terrorism in any country, and especially not here in the United States, in a country where I can live here and speak freely, you can stand there and speak freely, and that's the kind of country that I want to live in, and I want to be part of the discourse.
And we want to make sure we protect this country, and we do work with a lot of moderate Muslims, like I said, who even come and speak at our national conference. What we're talking about now, Islamic terrorism. When you're watching the news this morning and you're hearing about terrorists in Syria, in Jordan, in Lebanon, at Boko Haram, in Sudan, in Nigeria, in Chad, in Libya, I can go down the list. Every single instant when you're watching the news, it's not Buddhist terrorists, it's not Christian terrorists. Yes, there are some crazy people who commit terrorism, but right now the terrorism on mass scales, the bodies piled up, the people being beheaded, even Muslims shooting other Muslims, like what we watched in Iraq because they did not believe them that they were Sunnis. That is barbarism on a mass scale.
Heavy emphasis was placed on the idea that terrorism does not equal Islam, and that we must not alienate Muslims. This sounds tolerant, but becomes a lost argument when confronted with repeated real-world outcomes. Every day, news from Syria, Nigeria, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Europe shows the same source of mass violence. You'll rarely see Buddhist or Christian terrorists operating on this global scale today. The reason is simple. The ideological fuel in the Quran and Sunnah commands to fight disbelievers, strike necks, and establish dominance, remains active for those who take it literally. Denying this connection protects the ideology at the expense of public safety.
In civilized society.
As long as you clarify and you stand up and say that the fringe extremists of any faith are only a tiny minority in the larger faith, this is what we want you to talk about. When you talk about Islam and you talk about the Quran, the 1.4 billion people across the world follow the word of the Quran. You just got to make sure that you're being specific when you talk about terrorism of any faith, but more specifically, Islamic terrorism.
They're not waiting to hear your opinion or my opinion. They want to kill us both. And this is why we must discuss how we can defeat the radicals who want to kill us, who are using the Quran as their source and justification for their murder.
Why are we having this discussion if you and I are irrelevant? Why the discourse? Why the debates? Why the analysis?
Exactly.
If we are irrelevant.
Because right now what we need to be talking about is how we can defeat.
Now listen to this other shocking revelation by the outspoken media lady when she documented what happens in a Muslim-dominated neighborhood she grew up in.
First, let's just start with your story. You grew up in Lebanon. People don't know much about Lebanon. Tell me a little bit about
No, they don't. And this is why I am so passionate about this issue, because terrorism affected my life personally in Lebanon. You know, people ask me all the time, Brigitte, where does this passion comes from? And I tell them, because terrorism changed my life. I was born into a country, Lebanon, that used to be majority Christian country when I was a child. We were open-minded, we were fair, we were tolerant, we were multicultural. We prided ourselves on our multiculturalism. We had open open border policy. We welcomed everyone into our country because we wanted to share with them the westernization which we had created in the heart of the Middle East. Muslims used to send their children to study in our universities. They graduated and worked in our economy because we had built the best economy in the Middle East.
Yeah, didn't they call Beirut was the Paris of the Middle East or something?
Paris of the Middle East,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, all that began to change as the Muslims became the majority and the Christians became the minority. And that's when my life changed. I remember we used to go to Beirut for Christmas to visit with the rest of my family. I lived in the south with my parents. And we stopped going, and I would ask my father why we're not going to the family for Christmas or Easter. And he would tell me, well, we decided to stay home this year. And I couldn't understand, why we decided to stay home. You have to understand I was an only child to an elderly couple. It was very boring. And then I later learned that the reason why we stayed home is because the radical Islamists and Palestinians would set up a fly-by-night checkpoint and would stop cars traveling. And they would ask people for their IDs when they would stop them. Mm-hmm. And in Lebanon, our religion is written on our national ID. You are either a Christian, a Muslim, or a Jew. Mm-hmm. So when they find out that you are a Christian, they would get everybody out of their car and shoot them in cold blood. It became known as identity killing at the time. Mm-hmm. Thomas Friedman talks about it in his book From Beirut to Jerusalem.
Her story is very terrifying. She is absolutely true on Islam. The world needs to wake up in Islam extremism.
That changed our lives. But really the turning point was in 1975 when radical Islamists blew up my home, bringing it down, burying me under the rubble wounded. As they shouted, Allahu Akbar.
You were about 10 or something,
10
right?
years old. I ended up in a hospital for 2.5 months. And as I laid in a hospital bed going from surgery, one surgery to another, I would ask my father, why did they do this to us? And my father would tell me, because we are Christians, the Muslims consider us infidels and they want to kill us. So I learned since I was a 10-year-old little girl that I am wanted dead simply because I was born into the Christian faith.
Yeah.
Whether I practiced it or not, it was irrelevant in my enemy's eyes.
Yeah.
And that's why people in America don't understand. They think when people say, especially from the Middle East, I'm a Christian or I'm Muslim. In America, they think, well, I'm a Christian only if I'm a practicing Bible thumper, holy roller, speak in tongue, that makes me a Christian.
Right, right.
Well, for us in our region of the world, whether you're practicing or not, you belong to the Christian race or group.
Yeah.
And that's why they want to kill you. It doesn't matter whether you practice your religion or not.
Right, even though, of course, a religion isn't even a race, but you're saying it that way to illustrate the point that
You
for them it doesn't matter.
Group.
Yeah.
In other words, if your grandparents were Christians, it doesn't matter if you have been 2-generation atheist. You are a Christian.
Yeah.
That's how your enemy looks at you. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, all these terrorist organizations, all these radical, devout Islamists look at you, look at America as a Christian nation.
Yeah.
Not because we practice Christianity. Look at you as a Christian. Whether you practice Christianity or not is irrelevant.
Right.
Your great-great-great-great-great-grandparents were either Jews or Christian. Therefore, you belong to either one or two of that sect.
Right. You could be the biggest heathen atheist on the planet.
Doesn't matter.
They wouldn't like you for that either, but...
Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You belong to that. You're an...
Now, if the majority of Muslims are truly moderate and peaceful as claimed, why do terror groups quoting the Quran and Sunnah continue to find so much support, funding, and recruits for within Muslim communities worldwide? Once again, don't forget to hit the comments and tell me what you think. And if you found this breakdown insightful, kindly share, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.